In this lecture, I want to give you a little bit more detail about the CSS. So this is our web page, essentially as we designed it one of the previous times. There is a title, a subtitle, a paragraph, a list, a paragraph, and that's it. Okay, and this is how it renders on the left. And the styling is provided by this CSS file called mystyle.css. We can go look at it. It's very simple. It simply says the abstract should be blue and the font size 1.5, the normal size of text. Okay. So here I want to show you how CSS works if you want to do very slightly more complicated things. And essentially I want to tell you how do you decide where styling applies in the text. So imagine we want to add a footer here. So I can say div, and this will be where the footer will be. And inside I can put a paragraph that contains some text. For example, this is my footer. The footer is typically the bar at the bottom of a page. So if I simply do this, well, it doesn't look great. It doesn't look like a footer. So the first thing is, how can I tell that this div needs to be rendered as a footer, whereas other divs in the page, for example, I may add one before just to show the difference, div, this is not a footer. This is just other text. Okay, so how do I differentiate between the rendering of these two pieces? Let me just align these for beauty. Okay, how can I refer to one place and not the other? So every tag has various attributes that you can have, but the most important are class, and you can add multiple classes, and the other one is ID. Okay, and you can give it a name like ID footer. Okay, and class could be footer. Essentially, think at class and ID as nicknames that you can give to HTML elements in order to be able to distinguish them from others that have the same name. You see, you have multiple divs, but only this div below will be of class footer and with ID footer. The difference between class and ID is the following. ID is meant to be unique in the whole page. If you give an element the name ID footer, there is not supposed to be any other element called ID footer in the page. If you have multiple ones, in fact, the behavior is not well defined of what will happen when you refer to one of them. Okay? Class, instead, is meant to be an attribute that says how something should look like, and so you can have many things in the same page that are of the same class. Of course, in a page you have only one footer, but I think it's still better style to use class. Typically, you use ID. In modern development, actually fairly rarely, you use ID just when you want to refer to a very specific element that for some reason, which we don't really have here. So now this div has class footer, but of course it's still not rendered as a footer, right? I haven't defined any style rule that applies to it. So how can I define a rule that applies to this div and not to the one above? Well, if I go into the style, I can do it by saying div of class footer, okay, and I may want to say that the color of the text has to be not quite black, maybe dark but not completely. So I can say color. You specify the colors using this hexadecimal notation in which you say what are the values of the red, green, and blue, where each pair of RR, GG, and BB is the hexadecimal value of the intensity of the red, green, and blue. For example, if I use 10, 10, 10 in hexadecimal, that will be dark but not quite black. Okay, if I use the 2020. This will be a little bit lighter if I use say 90-90-90. This will be quite light. The middle gray, by the way, is 80-80-80. So why not? Let me use middle gray. So if I just do these, what happens? It happens that the text here becomes light gray. Okay, this is good. Actually, I could have done a little bit better. It's not all the text in the footer that I want of this color, but I want the text in the paragraph that is inside the div footer to be of that color. So this brings us to selectors. You see, I can specify a tag of a particular class with this dot notation, and this space here between footer and p means any paragraph that is nested inside a div of type footer. So the space is used to express the containment relationship in HTML. Look at it. This paragraph is inside a div of class footer. This paragraph, these two paragraphs above, the abstract and this other paragraph here, they're not inside a div of class footer. They're paragraphs, but not inside. Okay? So by saying div.footer p, I mean the paragraph inside the div footer. That's gonna be of this middle gray color, not the other ones. Let's see whether this works. Yes, this works. I mean, you don't see any change because even before I had colored it gray. Now, there is one interesting thing if you think at it logically, right? Let me say now that the paragraphs, any paragraph, I want to have a color that is oh, fun, I can choose here directly. So it's, let me make them brown. Why not? Okay, so some colors are predefined in HTML. So let's see what happens if I give this declaration. Okay. So why did this happen precisely? Well, let's look at the page. So this paragraph here is a paragraph, and it's not inside a class footer, and if you look at the rules that apply, this is the only rule that applies to it, because it's not a paragraph of class abstract, and as I mentioned, it's not a paragraph inside a div of class footer. So there is only one rule that applies, and there is no ambiguity. Hence, this paragraph here is brown. Now, let's look at this paragraph, at my footer paragraph. Why exactly is it gray? If you look at it, there is a bit of doubt, right? Because it is a paragraph, and so it should be brown. This is one possible rule that you could use in order to decide the color. And it is a paragraph inside a div footer, and so it should be gray. So will it be brown or gray? In CSS, there is the principle that the most specific rule applies in case of doubt. So look at this rule. This applies to all paragraphs. This rule is more specific. It applies to paragraphs inside a div of class footer. This is a more restrictive rule, and hence it applies. It's like a little bit when you read a piece of legislation. It says pedestrians can cross the street on the stripes, and then you add another rule. Oh, but pedestrians cannot cross the street on the stripes if a policeman tells them explicitly that they can't. You can make a more specific rule, and the more specific rule typically is the one that applies. And the same is what's going on here. Okay, so in the end, the footer will be gray because this rule is more specific than that one. Now let's try to do something more. I want this to look like a footer slightly better. I can also say that the div of class footer, I want the text align to be center. So this will make the text centered. I can test it immediately. And I also want the background to be maybe some kind of light gray. Text background, sorry, is background color, I should say, background color. Or I can even choose here, yeah, why not? But all I wanted was a light gray, so perhaps it's easier to generate it. BB. That should be light gray with a hash at the beginning. Okay. Hey. Okay, fine. No, it's not light enough. Maybe CC. Okay. So let's look at it. Okay, this is fine. No, this background needs to be lighter. Okay. But especially, I need a little bit more space around this is my footer, okay? So in this paragraph, I need, well, I could define either some padding in the footer, the padding applies inside to the content, or I could define some margin in the text. Let me define some padding here. And I say padding, I can say that it is, for example, 20 pixels all over the place in each direction. Well, this will generate quite a big footer, okay? And then I want some margin at the top, right, to separate the footer from the line above. And so I can say margin top, and I can say, for example, 10 pixels. Okay, well, 10 pixels is maybe not so cute. I can make it 20. Okay. One way to decide how many pixels you want, by the way, is to say that you want to inspect the element. And if you do so, it tells you exactly what the margins are, and I think you can change them. So instead of 20 pixels, you want to see how it looks. So if you had a 50 pixels, so that's how it would look like. And so you can quite easily see the structure of the page. You can even edit the page if you like, by the way, directly here. You can edit the spacing here, and you can edit the stylings here. For example, suppose I want to remove the text align center. If I unclick these, the text is no more aligned at the center. I can eliminate the background color, and I can also write some new styling directly here. For example, I can say, text weight, and I can say bold. No, I used the wrong styling. Text font weight, and I can say bold. Okay, and this makes it bold. Okay, this is nice. Well, perhaps it's not so nice with the font weight bold, but the font weight bold. So if you make a change here, the change is of course not reflected in your source code. Okay, so if you fix your web page by playing with the browser inspection tools, you should remember then, of course, to copy your values in your CSS file. Okay, because if I reload the page, of course, these changes are lost. Okay. Now, this is all very good and well, but CSS has a few problems. So it's not really a full-fledged language. In particular, it lacks a couple of things that are quite useful. Let me show to you by example what these are. Imagine that I wanted to have these ones of a specific color. Well, not very difficult, I can say. a UL that contains an li element. The li element should have color, and then I define my beautiful almost green color, for example, tutu AA tutu. Okay, this is a nice shade of green, or I hope so. Yes. And then imagine that I also want these other footer to have the same color. Okay, so how do I do that? Well, I go to the page. Maybe I want to say that this has a class like QtDiv is my class. I can go here and say, oh, and by the way, a div of class QtDiv, see how helpful PyCharm is, also has color that is tutu AA22. Okay, and so if I do this and I refresh, nothing happens. Where is my bug? QtDiv. Oh, it's simply that I forgot the hash. Okay, so if I do this, it works, but there is at least one very ugly thing. You see, I had to type twice the same color string. You may imagine that I am able to do something like this. Var x is equal to hash tutu bb tutu aa tutu, okay, and then here I can write x. This would be a sort of reasonable assumption, right? In most programming languages you have ever seen, you can actually define variables. But in CSS you can't. CSS is not really a language, it's simply markup, and you don't have variables. I mean, if you think at it, even in HTML you don't have variables, right? If you have to repeat a text many times, you have to type it in many times or cut and paste it in many times. You cannot define, string s is equal to this and then put it out many times. But CSS is limited in that it doesn't enable you to define variables. This may seem minor, but it's a real pain for developing large sites. Because when you develop a large site, typically you have your own color scheme in mind. Okay, titles will be this shade of green, the other things will be that shade of green, and you have all these shades of green that then you are going to use in many circumstances. And it would be incredibly annoying that if you decide to change a particular shade of green, you have to search and replace that particular hexadecimal string all over the place. Okay? You want to have a notion of variable. So here it works again. The other limitation, we have seen it above. You see there is div footer p and div footer. So this div footer has both a declaration that is general to it and a declaration that is only true for the paragraphs that are inside. Okay, this is okay, I mean it's still readable, but the way I would really want to write it is something like this. Div footer, I'm just cut and pasting from above, okay? Oh, sorry. This is okay, but the real way in which I would like to do it is as follows. I would like to be able to write div footer, okay, and once I'm here, I would like to be able to have these 4 lines, that is what the styling for a general div footer, and then be able to say right here inside, oh, by the way, if you are in a P inside the div footer, then this rule applies, that the color should be this one, right? I would like to be able to have a notion of nesting. So this is not needed. This is what I would like to have. The problem is that this is not proper CSS. But nesting is incredibly useful because, let me give you a fantasy example because, I don't have a page to illustrate it immediately. But the idea is this. Maybe I have a page that consists of a form of class my form and of another region that is like the header choices, which contains, or maybe the menu, which contains the menu. Okay, so I have these two things. And inside my form, I will have a gazillion elements. For example, I will have an input field of type of class Qt that will have its own rules. Then I will have an input field of class ugly, and so in fact when I write it, I'll have a lot of input fields. Some of them are of class Qt, some of them are of class ugly, some of them are of class terror, no, to signal that there is an error somewhere, for instance. And then I don't not only have inputs, but I have maybe button elements. And so I would like to keep all this styling for the form gathered together if I could. And I would like to have all the styling for the menu, in which I also will have a lot of stuff. Maybe I will have plenty of buttons in the menu, etc., nested in its own place. So you see, CSS per se does not have any notion of nesting. I have to say the div footer that contains a p completely separate from the div footer. There is no association between these two. I would like to nest them so that my declarations for a page are much easier to read, and it is much easier to ensure also when you are writing your definitions that that there is only one definition that applies to the element you want, right? And so to achieve these, unfortunately, we cannot use CSS. We have to use an extension of CSS that is called Sass, that I will present in the next lecture, okay? So the limits of CSS, in my view, and also I believe in the view of developers of Sass, are that it lacks variables and it lacks nesting. And these two elements are brought in by Sass, which is essentially an authoring framework for writing CSS in a more pleasant and reasonable way.